In October 1886, in the town of Williston, North Dakota, the early cold of the season arrived sooner than usual, sweeping through the still poor and sparsely populated land. Widow Eleanor Briggs, 54 years old, lived alone in an old log cabin that her husband, a miner, had left behind before dying 2 years earlier in a mine collapse. The cabin was too cold, heat escaped through the gaps in the walls, and the leaking roof meant warmth could not be retained even though she burned wood all night. Years living alongside miners had taught Eleanor a basic truth. Fighting winter by burning wood was a battle that could never be won, especially for an older woman who no longer had the strength to split logs as she once did. One evening, the temperature dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. While stepping out behind the cabin to gather the last remaining firewood, Eleanor saw her dog Bear digging a hollow in the ground against the hillside and curling up inside it motionless. Instead of shivering in the wind, it lay still as if it had found a stable place. She knelt down and reached her hand into the damp soil. The ground was warmer than the cabin. Not warm in a comfortable sense, but clearly the temperature beneath the soil layer was more stable than the freezing air outside. That sensation immediately brought her back to her husband's notes, ones she still kept at the bottom of a trunk. Among them was a line that had once made her laugh, but now seemed profoundly accurate. At a depth of a few feet, the ground temperature remains nearly constant year-round, around 52-55 degrees Fahrenheit. This was no longer just animal instinct. It was a principle of physics that every miner knew. Deep soil retains heat. Soil is not affected by cold winds. Soil does not lose heat as quickly as air. The idea flashed clearly, so vividly, that she had to pause for a moment to breathe. If the ground temperature stays stable, then why not create a shelter, right in the earth itself? A place that would not require burning so much wood, that wind could not steal from, that ice could not invade night after night. The next day, rumors spread throughout Williston that Widow Briggs planned to dig a tunnel into her cabin. No one understood the reason, but everyone quickly mocked her. A man at the town market shouted loudly in the crowd, "Widow Briggs has gone mad again." Another added, "More like digging her own grave." Children ran around the main street of the town, calling her Batcave Grandma, with gleeful laughter. But Eleanor paid no attention. She knew that most of them had never read a single technical note in their lives, and none had ever descended into a deep mine to feel the stable heat in the earth as the miners had described. That afternoon, she went to Hargreaves's store to buy a pickaxe, shovel, oil lamp, and several wooden planks for shoring. Conversation in the store immediately stopped. All eyes turned to the thin woman with cracked hands and a determined gaze. Hargreaves leaned on the counter. "Do you think a woman can dig a proper tunnel?" A woman standing nearby whispered, "If the tunnel collapses, don't blame anyone." Eleanor did not explain. She knew they did not understand principles like soil stability, load distribution, or simple shoring techniques to hold the tunnel walls, things she had read hundreds of times in her husband's notebook. She simply placed the money on the counter and said briefly, "I'm not afraid of being buried. I'm more afraid of being killed by the cold." Then she walked out of the store, carrying the tools, carrying her determination, and an idea that the entire town considered insane. But to Eleanor, it was not insanity. It was physics. It was miner's experience. It was the only thing that could save her through the coming winter. And she had decided she would dig. Eleanor began digging the tunnel on the 3rd of November 1886, when the outdoor temperature was only 19 degrees Fahrenheit. She removed a section of the back wall of the cabin, creating an opening about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high, just enough for her to stoop and enter. The early winter soil had frozen into hard clumps, nearly as hard as soft rock. Each time she swung the pickaxe, the recoil jolted back into her shoulders, making them numb. She had to use short, focused strokes, dividing the ground into small grids to break it gradually, just as miners did when breaking the top layer. On the first day, she only managed about 6 inches of depth. On the second day, she increased it to 7 inches. On average, she progressed only 5 to 8 inches per day, equivalent to 0.4 to 0.7 feet. For every foot of length, she had to remove nearly 160-200 pounds of dirt and rock fragments. That figure alone spoke to the immense physical toll on a 54-year-old woman. After 5 days, Her hands were torn and cracked, the layers of skin splitting in the cold, blood soaking into the pickaxe handle. She had to wrap linen cloth around her hands and apply a layer of bear grease to prevent further splitting. The thumbnail on her right hand broke off nearly a third of its length, and her wrist swelled to nearly 1.5 inches in diameter, making every swing of the pickaxe send sharp pain up to her elbow. But she continued. Bear always lay right at the tunnel entrance. Whenever Eleanor pushed out a large rock weighing 8-12 pounds, the dog would nudge a few smaller ones outward with its muzzle, as if understanding she was doing something vital. That simple act gave her far more strength. At night, Eleanor sat by the fireplace, rereading the miner's notes her husband had left. The page she turned to most often stated clearly, basic shoring requirements. Vertical posts spaced 2 feet apart, horizontal beams at least 2 inches thick, load evenly distributed across 2-3 contact points. This was not mere theory. It was what had saved the lives of dozens of miners in tunnels 6,100 feet deep. Another note from her husband analyzed lateral soil pressure. At a depth of 6 feet, lateral pressure from frozen clay can reach 35-45 pounds per square inches. Without proper shoring, collapse is immediate. Eleanor knew well, if she got one detail wrong, she would be buried alive. But at the same time, she understood that soil was not the enemy. Soil only collapses when humans force it to stand incorrectly. That mindset kept her persistent. By the 7th day, townspeople rumored that Eleanor was digging her own grave. The rumor reached Sheriff Walter Crowley. He immediately rode over, fearing the worst. When he entered the cabin, he froze. Eleanor was propping a 2-inch thick plank against the tunnel ceiling, her hands covered in dried blood. He shouted, "Mrs. Briggs, stop this at once. You'll be buried alive." But Eleanor did not look up. She wedged the final cross brace into place, letting it lock with the 2 vertical posts exactly 2 feet apart, just as the miner's notes specified. Then she handed Crowley the notebook. She opened it to the page with the load distribution formulas and said, "The soil load will be distributed from the high point down to the arch footings. Posts every 2 feet ensure pressure remains stable. If placed correctly, the soil will compress against itself and not collapse." Crowley took the notebook and examined the diagrams with 30 degrees and 45 degrees angles, soil grain lines, and methods for wedging rocks to hold the tunnel face. He could not deny that she understood these principles better than many men in town. But the worry remained. To test it, Eleanor asked him to kick one of the posts as hard as he could. Crowley did so with full force. The post did not budge. He was silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "I didn't think a woman could do this." Eleanor replied immediately, "I'm not fighting the soil. I'm working with it." That night, the temperature fell to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the first snow began to blanket the cabin roof. The wind howled, making the cabin shake slightly. Eleanor knew winter had officially begun, and she had no time left. The very next morning, she lit the oil lamp and returned to the tunnel, even though her hands still throbbed with every movement. Over the next 3 days, she dug nearly 2 more feet of depth. By the 12th day, the tunnel was nearly 10 feet deep from the cabin entrance. The air in the cabin was so cold that moisture from her breath froze into tiny ice particles as soon as she exhaled. But inside the tunnel, when she inserted a thermometer into the soil 4 or 5 feet below the surface, it showed a stable temperature of 48-50 degrees Fahrenheit, already nearly 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the cabin, even though the tunnel was not yet complete. That difference confirmed to Eleanor that she had chosen the right path. When the tunnel reached the necessary depth, she moved to the second phase, building a stone arch. Based on the miner's notes, she knew a stone arch needed 3 elements to stand: a perfect 180 degrees curve, flat stones locked together under compression, and a keystone placed exactly at the tightening point. Eleanor carried a wooden tub to the creek and began collecting stones. She sorted them by size: large 8-12-inch stones for the base of the arch, medium 4-7-inch stones for the body, and thin, flat 2-3-inch stones to lock the gaps. Any stones that did not meet minimum hardness, tested by striking with a hammer and listening for a dull sound, were discarded. She built a semicircular wooden frame 3 feet wide and 2.5 feet high, exactly sized for the tunnel passage. This frame would hold the entire arch until the keystone was placed. She mixed her own mortar from wood ash and clay in a 1-to-2 ratio, creating a mixture sticky enough to fill gaps, but not so rigid as to make the arch artificial, something her husband had emphasized. Mortar is only support. Compression is what holds the arch. As she began placing the first stones, villagers again gathered outside the cabin. One man said, "A woman building an arch? It'll collapse tomorrow." Another smirked. "If the keystone is off by even an inch, the whole tunnel goes." They were not wrong. A stone arch could collapse instantly if off by 1 degree, or if the keystone was misplaced by 0.5 inches, causing all the load to shift to one side. But Eleanor did not respond. She placed each stone along the curve of the frame, testing each by hand to ensure it bore compression well. After every 6-7 stones, she stepped back to check the curve. If it was off, she adjusted immediately. Every step followed the principle her husband had written. An arch stands by the trust between its stones. If one stone betrays, all fall. For hours, she heard only the sound of stones clicking together and her own breathing. The mocking voices outside gradually grew quieter but did not disappear entirely. She could barely feel her hands anymore. Each 5-10-pound stone made her wrists ache as if they might crack. But the arch slowly curved upward, inch by inch, layer by layer, forming the shape of a structure no one believed a woman could create. Tension rose with every stone placed nearer the top. The atmosphere in the town, in the cabin, and even in her own chest felt taut like a bowstring about to snap. But Eleanor knew one thing. Winter waited for no one. If she did not finish, she would die. And that thought kept her steady as she placed the next stone. Even though her hands were torn to the point that blood seeped through the linen cloth, she continued. Because this was not a luxury project. It was her only chance to survive. And every swing of the pickaxe, every stone, every drop of sweat all brought her closer to the only shelter that could endure a North Dakota winter. She knew she was building not just a tunnel, she was building life itself. After 14 days of tirelessly placing each stone, the stone arch was nearly 95% complete. Eleanor crouched beneath the curve of the arch, holding a wooden mallet and tapping each joint to check solidity. A steady thunk-thunk indicated the stones were properly locked under compression. A slightly hollow sound signaled an imperfect spot. She paused at those points, spreading more ash clay mortar and gently adjusting the stones for even load distribution. The work was so meticulous that she forgot hunger, aware only of weight, slight vibrations, and the reaction force from each stone. It was as if she were communicating with the structure itself through her fingertips. Finally, only one stone remained, the keystone. The wedge-shaped locking stone, weighing nearly 18-20 pounds, and the largest in the entire arch, held the role of locking all compression forces along the correct axis. If placed wrong by an inch, the whole arch could collapse. If placed perfectly, it could stand for decades. Eleanor hugged the stone to her chest, breathing heavily, arms trembling from exhaustion and weight. At the cabin entrance, 3 townspeople stood 15-20 feet away, arms crossed, faces mixing anticipation and mockery. One said quietly but loud enough for her to hear, "If it's off, she's done for." Eleanor did not reply. She climbed onto 2 temporary wooden supports, lifted the keystone into the remaining gap at the top of the arch. Left hand holding, right hand adjusting the angle. She took a deep breath, then released. The wedge slid perfectly into place, fitting against the adjacent stones as if it had been born to be there. A small click sounded the mark of perfect compressive balance. The arch did not move. The 3 onlookers stood frozen, silent as statues. No one spoke. No laughter. No mockery. Just a long silence that Eleanor understood clearly. They had just witnessed something they believed impossible. But the most critical step remained, removing the frame. This was the moment of truth. If the frame was removed and the arch collapsed, 2 weeks of effort would turn to rubble instantly. Eleanor took the wooden mallet and lightly struck the first support beam. It popped out, dirt dust falling onto her face. The arch held. She removed the second, the third, then the deeper ones inside. Each removal sent showers of dirt down, and the held breath of those standing outside the tunnel was almost audible. When the final support was pulled, she stepped back, eyes wide. The stone arch did not shift, sag, or slide. It stood as clear proof. Her husband's techniques, ones people considered men's theory, were completely correct. Next, Eleanor made the tunnel door. She took a 4-inch thick oak plank and sawed it herself into a circle about 32 inches in diameter. She shaped the edge to match the arch radius exactly, ensuring that when closed, the door would press against the surrounding soil and create a tight seal. She installed reused hinges from an old barn door, then tested, pushing the door in. It locked with a solid thud, secure as the lid on a whiskey barrel, not a single gap for wind to slip through. The final critical step, checking temperature. Eleanor inserted an old thermometer into the soil wall about 2 feet from the surface. While waiting, she sat down to repair cracked mortar at the arch base. The needle slowly moved. 47 degrees Fahrenheit, 51 degrees Fahrenheit, then settled at 57 degrees Fahrenheit. While the cabin above was only 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and outdoor temperature neared 18 degrees Fahrenheit. This could not be coincidence. The ground heat was holding steady just as her husband's notebook recorded. The deeper, the warmer. For the first time, Eleanor felt she had truly chosen the right path. Before she could reflect further, Bear ran into the tunnel, sniffed around once, then curled up on the warm earthen floor and let out a satisfied sigh. It had never done that in the cabin during cold weather. Eleanor sat beside it, gently stroking the fur behind its ears. "If Bear trusts it," she whispered, "so do I." Above ground, the cabin still trembled slightly in the cold wind. But deep in the earth, beneath the newly completed stone arch, Eleanor and Bear had a place warmer than any corner of the decaying house above. And that moment, the moment she saw the nearly 16 degrees Fahrenheit difference between cabin and tunnel, signaled that the greatest challenge of winter still lay ahead. But at least she now had a chance to survive. And that chance was built from stone, from soil, and from her own bloodied hands. On the 18th of December, 1886, the blizzard arrived without any warning. The morning sky was still clear, but by noon, northwest winds had risen to 60-70 miles per hour, slashing through the Red Willow Valley like a giant blade. Black clouds poured down from Montana so fast that looking into the distance revealed only a massive steel wall advancing straight toward the town. Eleanor looked out the cabin window and knew immediately. This was not an ordinary cold wind, but the kind of storm that could take lives. In less than an hour, the cabin began shaking violently. The old beams creaked with every gust, as if the house needed only one more powerful blast to be uprooted from its foundation. Wind forced its way through every wall crack, down to the floor, piercing her legs like icy needles. The temperature inside the cabin dropped from 41 degrees Fahrenheit to nearly 30 degrees Fahrenheit in minutes. So cold that Eleanor's breath turned to thick white fog right in front of her face. Bear let out a short whine, trembling from cold and from the groaning sounds of the cabin. Without hesitating another second, Eleanor scooped it up, ran straight to the tunnel door, pushed the heavy round door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut. The familiar thud sounded the tight seal, bringing instant relief. Inside the tunnel, an unusual silence fell. No more howling wind, no more rattling roof, only soft darkness and the warm air enveloping them. Bear immediately burrowed into her lap, its breathing no longer shaking as it had in the cabin. Above ground, the storm began destroying her home. Through the small ventilation gap, Eleanor could still hear wood groaning and snapping. The first section of roof was ripped off by the wind, crashing behind the cabin with a heavy impact. The stack of firewood she had split and piled high out back was blown away, the clattering of logs rolling across the frozen ground reminding her that if she had remained above, she would have been fighting every minute to survive. Meanwhile, the temperature in the tunnel did not fluctuate at all. Eleanor lit the oil lamp, then inserted the thermometer into the familiar soil slot. The needle held at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, then rose slightly to 56 degrees Fahrenheit after a few minutes. That alone was enough for her to place her hand on the earthen wall and close her eyes. This structure, the one the entire town had mocked for 2 months, had passed its first real test. Outside, the wind could break the cabin. But deep in the earth, where she had placed each stone with bloodied hands, the stability of temperature and structural strength had saved her. Eleanor hugged Bear tighter and whispered, "We're safe now." She did not know this was only the opening storm. But in that moment, the earthen tunnel had proven its worth. It preserved life. The first night in the tunnel, Eleanor sat close against the earthen wall, listening to the wind howling outside like wolves on the open plain. Each powerful gust caused the ground to vibrate slightly, the tremors traveling through the stone arch and into her back like constant warnings that the storm was tearing everything apart above. Bear pressed tightly against her legs, its body warm from fear and seeking safety. Eleanor placed a hand on its head, feeling the fur trembling with each rapid breath. But the tunnel remained solid, sealed, warm. In the dim golden light of the oil lamp, she suddenly remembered her husband. She recalled the moment he described miners who survived in tunnels after a mine explosion in Montana, when everything collapsed above. Only those quick enough to find a soil pocket had a chance to return. He had said something that now rang clear, as if he were sitting beside her. In the earth, we are safer than on the surface. At the time she had only smiled, seeing it as the words of a man accustomed to a lifetime underground, but now those words kept her mind from slipping into panic. After a few hours, Eleanor noticed the silence in the tunnel was almost surreal. The storm still ravaged her cabin, but here there was only the faint crack of the stone arch expanding with heat, Bear's steady breathing, and the sound of her own heartbeat in her chest. The stable warmth brought a level of peace she had not felt in years. Since her husband's death, the cabin had always felt too large for one person, too cold, too lonely. But in this small earthen space, a strange feeling emerged, a sense of being enveloped, not abandoned. As night wore on, hunger arrived. Eleanor pulled from her cloth bag a piece of hard, dry bread, chewing slowly to make the meal last. The small iron stove in the back of the tunnel, placed against the rear wall, burned only low enough to maintain warmth, conserving wood because she knew the cabin was surely destroyed and the firewood outside might be gone. Bear slept and woke repeatedly, sometimes burrowing its head into her stomach, sometimes circling the tunnel as if checking every corner, then returning to lie close to her. Through the second night, Eleanor's breathing sometimes slowed with worry. She thought about the town, wondering who was still alive, who was trapped. She did not dare open the round door to look. If wind rushed in at the wrong moment, the temperature could plummet to dangerous levels, and the tunnel would not recover warmth quickly enough. The isolation in the darkness let her mind wander to old fears, the fear of losing everything, the fear of past winters when she had struggled daily to keep the cabin from freezing. But here, at a steady 54-56 degrees Fahrenheit, she realized she was experiencing a kind of peace she had never known. The loneliness remained but was no longer sharp as a blade. It was only a quiet shadow accompanying her. By the third night, she heard the wind lessen its howl, the ground vibrations nearly cease. The air felt lighter. The storm was weakening. Bear stood first, shaking itself, ears pointed toward the tunnel ceiling as if checking the world outside. Eleanor knew it was time to prepare to emerge and see what remained. She added more oil to the lamp, placed her hand on the round door, but did not yet open it. Taking a deep breath, she thought, I survived in the earth. Now I must see what is left of the surface. And so, for the first time after 3 days living in the tunnel, the only warm place in a world being frozen solid, Eleanor was ready to face the aftermath of the blizzard. The faint but urgent knocking on the round door pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. When she cracked it open, Sheriff Crowley appeared through the swirling white wind, his face pale from the cold, with 19 people behind him, women, children, the elderly huddled together in the snow like figures about to collapse. Many had purple lips, frozen fingers, and a child wrapped in a torn blanket was crying silently, too cold to even breathe properly. Eleanor opened the door a bit wider, and the warmth from inside the tunnel rushed out, immediately making several people burst into tears from shock and relief. Crowley tried to speak, but his voice trembled violently. Cabins are all collapsed. The church lost its roof. The horse stables have broken walls. We have nowhere else to go. Eleanor looked at them, not the people who had once mocked her, not the curious shadows who watched her work, but human beings teetering between life and death. She flung the round door wide open without hesitating for even a breath. Come in, she said. Hurry. Crowley helped the elderly in first, then carried 2 children who were nearly motionless from frost. The others stooped low, one by one, to crawl through the door. the warmth inside pulling them into another world. In just minutes, the tunnel was packed with people. They sat close together, shoulder to shoulder, backs against the earthen walls, children in their mothers' laps, the elderly pressing their hands against Eleanor's small iron stove to thaw their fingers. Their breath formed a thin but warm mist spreading through the tight space. Eleanor handed out blankets, shared bread, added wood to the stove. Bear circled each person, sniffing, then lay in the middle of the group of children like a living heater. No one spoke for the first few minutes. They just breathed, shaky breaths becoming steady, then turning into sighs of relief. Finally, Crowley said quietly, "We owe you our lives." Eleanor simply replied, "This is the Earth's tunnel. Anyone who's cold has the right to enter." And on that winter afternoon, amid the town's desperation, the earthen tunnel of a widow once ridiculed became the only place still holding the warmth of life. The next 3 days in the tunnel were 3 days no one in Red Willow would ever forget. The space was so cramped that adults had to sit pressed against the earthen walls, shoulder to shoulder, heads nearly touching the arched ceiling. Young children lay on their parents' laps or curled up in the few remaining thin blankets. Bear circled each group, especially the children. It lay down beside the coldest ones, letting its back and body heat serve as a living stove for the tiny, trembling bodies. Every time it shifted, the kids buried their heads in its fur, as if just touching Bear could make them forget the terrifying wind howling outside. Food in the tunnel was scarce, but no one complained. They shared every bit, handfuls of grain, some dried beans, a few pieces of bread Eleanor had gathered before the storm destroyed the cabin. Each meal was just that, but no one dared eat more than others. One mother cut a slice of bread in half for her child, then silently pushed the remaining half toward an orphaned boy beside her. He bowed his head, saying no thanks aloud, but his teary eyes spoke for him. To forget the fear, people began telling stories. An elderly Norwegian woman shared Nordic tales of giant snow beings and 20-hour winter nights. Her voice shook but stayed steady, each story weaving together like a thread binding the whole tunnel. 3 children tucked in a soil nook began singing softly a hymn they remembered from the now roofless church. The sound was faint but enough to fill the dark space, making the tunnel feel less like a temporary grave and more like a small refuge for people holding each other alive. As more people filled the tunnel, their breath and body heat gradually raised the temperature. From the initial 56 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of the first day, it reached 59 degrees Fahrenheit. On the second day, the thermometer read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. By the third night, it hit 63 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that many cried from joy, having not felt warmth for weeks. A man who once told Eleanor she didn't know what she was doing, now knelt by the earthen wall, placed his hand on the warm surface, and whispered, "You saved us." Sheriff Crowley looked around at the faces, gradually turning pink again, and said quietly to Eleanor, "The whole town owes you." Those who had mocked her, who had called her Bat Cave Grandma, now lowered their heads when her gaze passed. They no longer saw a strange widow. They saw the person who gave them the only warm shelter after a storm that could have killed the entire community. In that cramped darkness, Eleanor Briggs, once ridiculed for a crazy idea, became the reason that entire group was still alive. When the blizzard finally stopped on the morning of the 4th day, Eleanor opened the round door and stepped out, the blinding white light of the snow forcing her to squint. The scene before her made her pause for several seconds. Snow buried up to the roof of her old cabin. Many homes in town half buried like giant white mounds. The church, the only spiritual anchor of Red Willow, had its bell tower collapsed into the yard, broken beams scattered everywhere. Hargreaves' store had half its roof torn off by the wind, the rest sunk in rubble. There was no distinguishing walls from roofs because everything was buried in snow, and the nighttime winds had rearranged them like the remnants of a battle. Crowley and several men immediately rolled up their sleeves to search for survivors. They shoveled through layers of snow, flipped displaced boards by hand. Every call of a name echoed into the frozen air. They found one man buried nearly entirely but still breathing weakly, pulling him near Eleanor's tunnel so the warmth from the door could revive his heartbeat. But not everyone was lucky. In total, 7 people died, a family of 3 crushed by a falling stable roof, an old man who couldn't escape his home in time, and 2 children buried on their way home from school. That loss plunged the town into silence. Not wailing grief, but the kind of silence from people too exhausted to cry. Eleanor's cabin, where she had lived for the past 2 years, was completely destroyed. The roof peeled clean off by the wind, walls broken in half, foundation warped. From a distance it looked like a house toppled by a giant beast. But right beneath that chaos, the round tunnel door remained intact, still in place, still shaped as if no storm had ever passed. Crowley stood before the remnants of the cabin, looked down at the tunnel door, and shook his head in disbelief. The only thing that survived the storm intact is what you built. Villagers gathered in small groups around the tunnel. Many looked at Eleanor with eyes completely changed, no more doubt, mockery, or whispering behind her back. Just the raw truth they had witnessed. Her earthen tunnel had saved them. A man who always called her crazy bowed deeply and said, "Without you, Mrs. Briggs, none of us would be standing here." A woman holding her young child choked up. "You kept the whole town warm." Eleanor looked at them, at the tunnel, at the sky. She said nothing. She just placed her hand on the stone arch the thing once ridiculed and felt the gentle warmth still radiating. Amid a devastated town, only one thing remained whole. The structure she had built with blood and will. The tunnel had not just endured, it had become the boundary between life and death for all of Red Willow. As the town gradually stabilized after the storm, the most obvious change was not the cleared paths or temporary roofs being raised, but the way people viewed Eleanor Briggs. From an eccentric widow, she became the person everyone approached first for advice. That morning, right in the snow-covered yard in front of the tunnel, Samuel Hargreaves, the man who once said she didn't know anything about soil and stone as a woman, suddenly knelt before her. He bowed low, voice choked. "I was wrong about you. I laughed and treated you like a joke. Without your tunnel, I might have lost my wife and both my kids." No one ever thought Hargreaves, the proudest store owner in Red Willow, could offer a public apology like that. But he was not the only one. A group of other men stepped forward, one by one admitting what they had never dared before. They had underestimated her, they were wrong, and they lived because of the shelter she built. After that moment, instead of turning away as before, villagers began asking questions. Lots of questions. How many feet deep do you dig for stable ground heat? Is 2-foot spacing for posts enough? How do you know when the soil starts bearing load well? How many stones for the arch? How to mix mortar so it doesn't crack? They asked eagerly, like students discovering the only teacher who could save them from the next winter. And Eleanor, instead of fearing or avoiding, stood tall for the first time and answered each one. She pointed to the ground, the tunnel walls, each post to explain clearly why wood grain must run a certain way, why earthen walls need a slight angle, why minimum depth must reach 55 degrees Fahrenheit for it to work. Everyone listened intently, jotting notes on crumpled paper scraps or carving into small wood pieces since paper in town had run out. When someone asked, "Are you sure you want to teach all of us? After everything we did to you?" Eleanor just smiled faintly, placing her hand on the stone arch as if touching an old companion through 2 months. Knowledge is like warmth. Only sharing it saves people. The earth doesn't keep warmth for just one person, and neither do I. From that moment, the widow once ridiculed became the guide for the entire valley. The difference was, she wanted no fame, no glory. She only wanted people to survive, and she understood better than anyone that winter would always return, and when it did, only those who knew how to work with the earth would have a chance to endure. Spring 1887 arrived with a strange rebirth in Red Willow. Melting snow revealed ruined foundations, but throughout the valley echoed the sounds of pickaxes, shovels, wood striking stone. In just the first 2 weeks, 12 families began digging tunnels following Eleanor's exact instructions. Minimum depth, 10-12 feet, posts spaced 2 feet, stone arch locked with a keystone, thick oak round door to block wind. Those who once doubted her now lined up along the hillsides, waiting their turn to ask, "Mrs. Briggs, is this deep enough? Will this stone lock the force? What soil moisture is best for placing the arch?" Eleanor walked along the work sites, pointing out where to reinforce, where to dig more, tireless despite her still scarred hands. Word spread so fast that by early May, a reporter from the Fargo Herald rode into town with a camera and notebook. He stood at Eleanor's tunnel door, listening intently as she explained how soil maintains stable heat in the heart of Dakota winters. 3 days later, the feature appeared with a bold front-page headline, "Widow's Earth Haven Saves Dakota Families." The article portrayed Eleanor as a symbol of resilience and native ingenuity. Not a weak woman, but one who read the laws of the earth and turned them into technique for human survival. The story sparked attention across the region. Just 2 weeks later, 3 neighboring towns, Willow Bend, Clay Point, and Hawk Ridge, sent people to Red Willow to learn to work with the earth. They followed Eleanor all day, measuring soil temperature with mercury thermometers, tapping stones with wooden mallets to hear the response, recording every anti-collapse principle just as miners do in deep tunnels. When Willow Bend's first earthen tunnel was completed, residents there held a small gathering but sent a thank you letter to Red Willow. Without Widow Briggs, our winter would have been a grave. The more people applied it, the more Eleanor's technique improved. That fall, Red Willow's church built a community tunnel holding over 40 people. The school added a shelter tunnel behind the yard. Some large farms dug dual tunnel systems, one for storm refuge, one for year-round food storage. By October, the method was considered the survival standard across 3 nearby counties. People began calling it by a familiar name, Briggs' Warm Haven Method. If asked, Eleanor just shook her head. "I didn't invent anything. The earth has always kept warmth. I only listened to it." But though she refused credit, her place in people's hearts was irreplaceable. When the reporter returned for a follow-up story, a Red Willow resident said, "Winters here are always long. But since Mrs. Briggs dug her tunnel, we know we won't be alone in the cold anymore." And so the technique of a once ridiculed widow spread across the valley, beyond Red Willow's borders, becoming a legacy not of one person, but of an entire region, learning to survive through the lessons Eleanor wrote into the earth itself. In her final years, Eleanor Briggs lived almost entirely in her earthen tunnel, where she continued repairing, reinforcing, and expanding with 2 small additional rooms connected by a gently curved passage. One room for winter food storage, the other for reading and writing down principles of depth, compression, soil heat, so future generations would not forget. The town's children, those she saved during the great storm years ago, now grown, each saw her as the shared grandmother of the region. They called her affectionately Grandma Briggs of the Earth. She never objected to the name. She just smiled, a toothless but warmer than fireplace smile. As old age came, her strength faded, but her memory and voice remained clear. One winter afternoon, as light snow fell at the tunnel mouth, a young boy asked, "Why aren't you afraid of winter anymore?" She placed her hand on the warm earthen wall and said slowly, "People can't defeat winter, but the earth can. If we listen and work with it, it will always keep us alive." That saying was later repeated across generations as a life philosophy for all of Red Willow. In 1919, Eleanor Briggs passed away in her sleep at age 87. Not in a bed, not in a drafty cabin, but in her own stable 58 degrees Fahrenheit earthen tunnel, the exact temperature she once used to convince doubters that the heart of the earth is warmer than a Dakota winter's heart. They found her lying on her side, hands on an old wool blanket, silver hair gently spread on the pillow she had sewn herself. Bear had died long ago, but its 3rd-generation descendant, a dark-furred, earth-gentle dog, lay at her feet as she took her final breath, as if continuing the promise of protection to the very end. Her funeral drew nearly everyone from Red Willow and the neighboring towns of Willow Bend, Clay Point, and Hawk Ridge. They erected a simple river stone grave marker with the inscription the whole region agreed on, "Eleanor Briggs, she listened to the earth, and it kept her people alive." No other words captured her as perfectly. Because Eleanor did not fight winter, she learned to go around it, hide beneath it, live with the earth while others still battled on the surface. And because of that, dozens, then hundreds of people across many winters kept their lives. Eleanor's tunnel became a local historic site in 1925. The earthen walls were reinforced, the oak round door preserved nearly original. Every winter, just before the first snow, Red Willow residents bring a bundle of dry grass to the tunnel door, not for building material, not for warmth, but to remind each other that survival sometimes begins with what is seen as madness. Children place the bundles solemnly. Adults stand silent a moment, as if listening to the earth she once heard. Many touch the stone arch and murmur the same words, "Thank you, ma'am." And each year, as winter sweeps over Dakota like an endless white beast, people retell the old story. They once laughed at a widow, but she saved an entire region. If you love stories of survival and human ingenuity against harsh nature, please subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next storytelling journey.